Okay, hi, welcome. In this video, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about wet effects, pre-amp or post-amp. This is not really a versus video. What I have encountered recently, I saw a few videos about this topic, about how you should put your effects pre the amp or whatever. Some people like it, some people don't. It's sort of the natural thing to do. It's funny, like if you've transferred from, an analog amp and then you first go in the box with a modeler, I think a lot of people probably maybe just naturally put the delay and reverb after the amp. But if you think about it, that's different than what you do with your pedal board. Most people with a pedal board and an amp are plugging your guitar into your pedal board, into your amp. Serial signal chain, and those delays and reverbs on your board are probably going into the front of the amp. And if you've never thought about this before, that's perfectly fine because that's a perfectly okay thing to do. If your amp has any amount of breakup on it, then you may have noticed that your delays can get kind of crazy. And this is the thing that we're going to look at here. What's the difference? What does it sound like pre? What does it sound like post? And so I wanted to address a couple of things. First of all, I wanted to put together this preset. And I wanted to do this in the FM3 specifically because in fractal land, if you look at the diagram of the amp block, the first thing that happens is sum to mono, which means you can't run you can run a stereo effect into the amp, but what it does is it sums that stereo effect to mono and then processes it through the amp, and then the output of the amp is dual mono. So if you're running a stereo delay into the amp block in the X effects, if you want stereo effects and them to be stereo in the output, you have to run two amps because you have to run one side for the left, one side for the right, run your stereo effect, split it into both, and then back out of both, right? Which in the FM3 you can't do because you only have one amp block. So how can we kind of deal with this? And I wanted to address that as well. So first thing, I played a little bit of a sound sample at the beginning. I believe I switched back and forth between the pre and the post there. So you kind of got a little bit of an idea of the difference. So yeah, I want to demonstrate how we can compare this in the FM3 and then really just give you a good sound comparison of like apples to apples. Same amp, same cabinet, same delay and reverb settings. What does it sound like if you do that in front of the amp or after the amp? And hopefully I can play the same riff consistently enough that you can hear the difference. I think we can. So let's dive into this preset first. What am I doing here? This looks kind of insane. So I think I need to explain it. First thing I want to note is we've got an amp and a cab. This is the Morgan AC30, which is my go-to. I'm using my exotic XSC2, the humbucker in the bridge, which I think will probably stay on the humbucker for this video because we want a little bit of breakup from the amp. And then for delay settings, I've got this stereo bucket brigade delay type, and I've got this large cloud reverb. And so scene 2 here is the post scene. Right now we're running post effects. And so here's what it sounds like just out of the box. This is sort of our bass sound. Okay, that's our bass sound. Now, what the heck else is going on in this preset? what I am able to do via the send and return and then these 3 mixers is switch between the delay and reverb being before the amp and after, so that I can just do it with a scene change like I did earlier. And I'll just show you step by step kind of how that's working. We got the input and immediately we split. Here's our sort of like regular signal path, right? Immediately we split. This mixer is allowing us to control whether or not the wet effects are hearing the input signal directly or the return signal, which is the after the amp signal. So you'll notice we go amp cab send, and the send block doesn't affect the output of the send block, is just whatever went into it. But it's letting you tap off that signal. So we go amp cab send to return. So this mixer is controlling what the wet effects see, the input to the wet effects. Is it the after the amp sound, as it is, so after the amp being post? If I switch to pre, you notice we're on a different channel of this mixer and we're using the row 2 gain. So we're taking the input signal, not the post amp signal, right? Okay, let's look at the other mixer here. This one is controlling whether the amp is seeing the wet effects signal or it's seeing the input signal, right? So channel B, row 2 here. So we're in the post. We want the amp to see, if on our post wet effects scene, we want the amp to see the direct signal. So here, mixer channel B is row 2 gain. That's our direct signal. If I switch to pre, you'll notice now this mixer is on a different channel, which is taking the row 3 gain, which is our wet effects gain, which is what we want in the pre. We want the wet effects going into the amp. So this is pretty self-explanatory, okay? But it's just, there's a lot of moving pieces. And it did take me, 10 minutes to figure this out. Okay, that's our second mixer block. Our third mixer block is controlling what we are sending to the output. So in our post scene, so wet effects after the amp, we want those wet effects to be routed to the output. So here we are sending row 3, which is our wet effects, to the output. If we switch to our pre-scene, so we want, in our pre-scene, we want the amp signal, the amp cab signal to be sent to the output. So in this scene, channel A of the mixer block here, the final mixer block, is sending row 2 to the output, which is row 2 is here. That's our amp and cab. So what we've got here is the ability, based on just changing the channels of all the mixers in coordination with one another, we have the ability to switch instantly between having our wet effects be before the amp and after the amp. And we're not changing any of the settings of those blocks. We're just switching the placement of them sort of in the routing, which is pretty cool. Now, there's one gotcha about this. You'll notice on the return level, I set this to have a scene control. And the reason I did that was not necessarily because I needed it to be controlled by the scene, because we're controlling it via the mixing. But what this gives me is now when we switch to using that, so now we're in our post scene, we're sending the amp input, we're using the amp input, we're using the return. All this is doing is that when the parameter changes, I wanted to set the attack, slow the attack down. Because what I noticed is if I set this to 0 milliseconds, there's a split second of feedback, just like a little beep. Because at some point in time, while it's switching, it's crossing over and it's sending to both at the same time, creating a feedback loop, and that's not good. So if we just dampen this return block input just a little bit when we turn it on, so here 100 milliseconds is quick enough that it's not annoyingly slow, but it's slow enough that it doesn't beep at us. So that's all that's for. I just wanted to call that out. If you're using this, if you download this preset, which I will upload, and mess around with this yourself, maybe throw your own favorite amps and delays in there just to try it out. I just want to call that out. Don't remove that parameter. Otherwise, you'll get a very loud beep. Okay, what else is there to talk about? Oh yes, the other thing I wanted to call out about this before I'll just do some playing samples and try chords and single note lines and just to do some sound comparisons. The last thing I wanted to call out was this enhancer block. This is only in effect on the pre-scene, right? You can see that it's on the pre-signal chain. Yeah, it's on the pre-signal chain because we tap out to the send here before this enhancer block. So this is only really on when we're in the pre-signal chain. I hope I haven't messed that up. I hope that's correct. Please tell me know in the comments if I screwed this up, and I'll do another video. Anyways, so the reason this is here is scene 1 and scene 2 are pre and post, and trying to be stereo pre and post. So maybe I should relabel them before I upload this preset as scene 1 is pre-stereo, scene 2 is post-stereo. And so this enhancer block is what's allowing us to get back some stereo width to the sound because it's been lost by summing to mono going into the amp. So that's all that is. And then there are 2 more presets which we'll compare and contrast as well. They're just mono versions of them. And all I did for those was for the pre-mono, I just disable the enhancer block. And for post-mono, if I go to that scene, for post-mono, you can see we're using channel C of this mixer, which is the same as channel B. It's using row 3 gain 100%, but I just flipped the mono stereo switch to mono, so that just sums everything to mono, so that we can compare pre and post both in stereo and in mono. So yeah, let's just get into some sound samples here. So I would default to using a post wet effects setup. So I'm going to start there, and then I'll toggle over. I'll play the same, chords or single note line, and I'll just go back and forth playing the riff under post and then playing it pre, and then hopefully you guys can, have some good headphones on, and it should be pretty obvious the difference, quite honestly, if you don't know already. But I just wanted to provide, for the internet, a good A/B comparison, direct comparison of what sounds different when you put the wet effects pre versus post. So yeah, here we go. So immediately you can hear the delay repeats sound much louder. And please look at this. It's not changing. This setting is not changing at all. Watch, I'll prove it to you. So here you go. Look at the mix on this delay. This is the same settings. Now we go to post. I mean, that's crazy, right? That's a huge difference. The amp compression, your amp block is a lot of things, but it's an EQ, it's a lot of other things. It is mainly a really aggressive compressor, right? And so when you take those delay repeats and you slam them into the amp block, the dynamic range between the repeats gets completely squashed. I mean, not completely squashed, but heavily squashed. If I have the mix of the delay mapped to this expression pedal, if I crank it all the way up to 50% and we start to do kind of that dotted eighth gallop thing, you really start to hear a difference. So let me play something like that. So hopefully you could really hear that, the galloping was, you're almost getting more than 50%. You're not getting more than 50%, but it's the dynamic range of those repeats that gets squashed. You can kind of emulate this if you get really nerdy with your delay repeat settings, or depending on the delay, it's easier to kind of achieve the similar level of dynamic range. But something that you absolutely cannot achieve in the post setup is probably the thing people love about the pre setup, which is that the delay repeats and the reverb tails themselves get distorted, and that has a certain sound to it that just sounds like the amp is exploding. It sounds like the amp is like, oh my God, I can't handle this. But that's a cool thing if you want it. It's a creative tool that you can reach for. So hopefully I can demonstrate what that's doing. I'm just gonna play some diamonds high up, and hopefully it'll be very clear. You can hear what I'm talking about. And hopefully I've described it well enough you can hear what I'm talking about. So here we go. So hopefully you heard that. Hopefully that was really obvious. I'm going to just hit it, do one quick hit, and let the delay repeats tail off so you can really listen to just the delay repeats and what's happening there. It's not going to be quite the same because your playing kind of amplifies it as well, but hopefully you'll be able to hear what's happening more clearly if I do that with just the delay repeats and the reverb. So here we go. I'm going to do pre first and then kick it over to post, and you'll be able to hear the difference. And you can just hear that there's even feels like there's more gain all the time, because you've got more signal going into the front of the amp all the time because you have your reverb on probably all the time, and maybe you have your delay on all the time, right? If it's an always on sort of setting, which this is not necessarily unless it's the type of song that you're going for. But yeah, so as a consequence, you probably would adjust your drive levels accordingly. So if I go ahead, I'm gonna kick on this drive pedal here, and I'll start with post. This is what I would normally use, is just the exotic RC booster, just everything straight at noon. I'll just leave it there. Normally I use a post setup, and this sounds good to me. So yeah, it would sound like something like this. If I do the same thing on the pre-setup, you'll hear how different the gain level is. It makes quite a bit more difference than even before. So anyways, I think that's all I need to demonstrate in terms of different things. I think we got some chords in there. We got some little lead lines. You heard the difference between the gain and the dynamic range of the repeats. Hopefully you heard that little like explosion, crackling thing that happens with the delays and reverbs when they go in front of the amp. Lastly, I just want to compare, I guess, the mono setups together. So if you haven't been listening in headphones, you probably want to go back and listen to those stereo ones with headphones on. Otherwise, here we're going to compare the mono setups together, and just to give you a better idea of what that sounds like if you really don't care about things going stereo. Here we go. I just had to double check that the drive block wasn't stuck on that pre-mono channel, because the drive levels are just so much higher when you run those wet effects in front of the amp, because you're just getting so much more signal saturating the amp and compressing and all that. So anyways, this video is probably way too long. You probably clicked off by now. If you haven't clicked off by now, I love you. Thank you. And yeah, hopefully this was helpful to you. And please download this preset, plug your own amp settings in there, your own delay settings in there, and give it a try. This is one of the great things I think about the modeling world, digital modeling world, is like something that normally might have been a product of circumstance, like you literally don't have an amp with a effects loop, or you don't have enough cables, or you've literally just never thought about running it in front of the amp or behind the amp or whatever, is now a creative choice. You decide, I like the sound of that, so I'm going to use that technique, versus, it's just a product of your circumstance, and you get what you get, which sometimes that's cool too. So anyways, have any of you tried this before? Do you find this useful? Please let me know. Thank you so much for watching if you watched this far. And remember, as always, if it sounds good, it is good. Thank you.